My son called me a burden at dinner. I stopped paying his $9,400 mortgage. The night my son called me a burden was supposed to be just another quiet family dinner, and if you've ever lived through a mother-son conflict, you'll understand how these moments don't start loud, they start soft, almost invisible. That's how most emotional story time begins, calm on the surface but heavy underneath. My name is Amora Velez, and for years I lived a life built on one parent sacrifice story after another. I gave everything, not because I had to but because I believed in love, in family, in showing up even when no one noticed. My son Darian had what most people would call a good life, a beautiful home, a stable routine, and the appearance of success. But behind that life was something no one saw. Me. I was the one covering the gaps quietly and consistently. Every month without fail I paid his $9,400 mortgage. Yes, you heard that right. And I never once complained because that's what mothers do. We give, we protect, we sacrifice, even when it slowly turns into toxic family relationships, even when the line between love and being used starts to blur. But here's the truth no one talks about in A Powerful Woman Story. Sometimes giving too much teaches people to take without gratitude. That night we sat around the table like any normal family. Plates clinked softly, conversations floated. His partner Vanya smiled politely. Everything looked perfect. But I've learned something in life. The most painful family betrayal story moments don't come with warning signs. They come disguised as casual words. Darian leaned back in his chair laughing lightly about something I barely remember now. Then out of nowhere he looked at me and said it. Mom, honestly you're starting to feel like a burden. And just like that the room went silent. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses against your chest and forces you to replay every memory in seconds. The disrespectful children moment that changes everything. I didn't react immediately. That's the thing about emotional strength. It doesn't always shout, sometimes it just sits there processing, because in that single moment I realized something I had ignored for years. This wasn't just a joke, this wasn't just a bad day, this was the result of years of quiet giving without boundaries, a slow slide into money and family conflict, a life where my love had turned into expectation, where my support had become invisible, where the woman who built everything had become optional and maybe even inconvenient. I looked at him, really looked, not as my son but as a man who had grown comfortable standing on sacrifices he no longer respected, and suddenly all the signs became clear, the subtle entitlement, the lack of appreciation, the way my contributions were never acknowledged in his version of reality. This wasn't just an ungrateful son story, this was a wake-up call, a moment every woman eventually faces in her independent woman journey, the moment you realize you've been pouring into people who no longer pour back into you. I smiled. Yes, I smiled, not because it didn't hurt but because something inside me shifted quietly and powerfully. That was the moment I began knowing your worth. The moment I understood that love without respect is not love, it's habit, and habits can be broken. The dinner continued but I barely heard anything after that because in my mind something had already started changing. For the first time in years I wasn't thinking about how to help him, I was thinking about myself, about my peace, my dignity, and the kind of life I deserved as a woman who had given everything. This wasn't anger and it wasn't revenge, it was clarity, the kind that only comes after deep emotional pain, the kind that builds the foundation for a true women empowerment story. Because here's what many people don't understand, setting boundaries as a woman doesn't start with shouting, it starts with silence, with reflection, with choosing yourself even when it feels unfamiliar. That night I went home and sat in the quiet with no distractions and no noise, just me and my thoughts. And for the first time I allowed myself to feel everything, the hurt, the disappointment, the truth. I opened my banking app and my finger hovered over the screen. This was no longer just a financial support story. This was about control, about respect, about redefining what my role in his life would be moving forward. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a life lesson story is nothing, no arguments, no explanations, just a decision, a quiet one, a firm one, a final one, That was the night I stopped being just a mother who gives endlessly and started becoming a woman who chooses herself. And trust me, what happened next, he didn't expect this. If this story touched you, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The house was quiet that night, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that forces you to hear every thought you've been avoiding, every truth you've been pushing aside. I sat on the edge of my bed, still replaying his words over and over again. Mom, honestly, you're starting to feel like a burden. That word didn't just sit in the air, it settled deep inside me, heavier than anything I had carried before. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been too afraid to face. When did my love become something you could dismiss so easily? When did all my sacrifices become so small in his eyes? I thought about the many years behind me, the long days, the sleepless nights, the choices I made so you could have better opportunities. I remembered the moments I chose his needs over mine without hesitation, the times I delayed my own dreams just to make sure you never struggled, and yet somehow all of that had led to this one moment where I was reduced to a burden. It didn't make sense at first, but slowly the truth began to unfold in a way that was both painful and clear. I had taught him how to treat me, not with my words, but with my actions. Every time I gave without limits, every time I said yes when I should have paused, every time I carried responsibilities that were never mine to carry, I was showing him that my effort required no acknowledgement, that my presence required no respect, and that realization didn't break me, it woke me up. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared out into the darkness. The world outside was still, but inside me something had started moving, something steady, something firm. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness anymore. It was awareness, the kind that shifts your entire perspective. I began to see my life not just as a mother, but as a woman who had value beyond what she provided, a woman who deserved to be respected, not tolerated, a woman who had every right to stop giving when giving was no longer appreciated. And in that moment I realized that this was my breaking point, not the kind that destroys you, but the kind that rebuilds you into someone stronger. I walked back to my room and picked up my phone. My hands were calm, steady, not rushed, not emotional, just certain. I opened my banking app and stared at the screen. The monthly payment was scheduled as always, $9,400, the number that had quietly controlled a part of my life for so long. I thought about how automatic it had become, how I never questioned it, never paused to ask if it was still right. I simply continued because that's what I had always done. But tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't acting out of habit, I was thinking with clarity. I asked myself a simple question: if I continue like this, what will change? And the answer came quickly: nothing. Nothing would change because nothing had changed all these years. And that's when I understood something powerful. Change doesn't come from waiting, it comes from deciding. I took a deep breath and hovered my finger over the screen. This wasn't just about money, it was about boundaries. It was about finally choosing myself without guilt, without fear, without hesitation. I didn't need to argue with him. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to prove anything. Sometimes the strongest message is sent through action, not words, and in that quiet moment, I made a decision that would shift everything. I cancelled the payment, just like that. No drama, no announcement, just a simple action with powerful meaning. I placed my phone down and sat back, waiting to feel something heavy, maybe regret, maybe fear, but instead I felt something unexpected, relief, a deep calm that settled within me, as if a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had finally been lifted. For the first time in a long time I felt in control of my own life again, not responsible for someone else's choices, not tied to expectations that were never appreciated, just free. The next morning the sun rose like any other day. Nothing outside had changed, but inside me everything was different. I moved through my routine with a quiet confidence, not needing validation, not seeking approval, just knowing that I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. Hours passed and my phone remained silent, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. reality as a way of catching up, especially when comfort is suddenly removed, and somewhere in the back of my mind I knew that soon Darian would notice, soon the calm life he was used to would start to shift, and when it did, he would be forced to face a truth he had ignored for too long, that the woman he called a burden was the very foundation he stood on. I didn't know exactly how he would react, whether with anger, confusion, or regret, but for once I wasn't trying to control the outcome, I was simply standing firm in my decision, because this was no longer just about him, it was about me, about my worth, about the life I deserved moving forward, and as I sat there in that quiet strength, I realized something I had never fully understood before. Choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary, and sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom, and trust me, what was coming next would change everything for both of us. The first call came just before noon, and I knew exactly what it was about the moment I saw Darian's name on my phone. I didn't rush to answer, I didn't feel that old urgency anymore. Instead I let it ring for a few seconds, not out of spite but out of something new, something steady, control. When I finally picked up, his voice wasn't the confident tone I was used to, it carried a sharp edge of confusion. "Mom, did something happen with the payment?" he asked, trying to sound calm but failing to hide the tension underneath. I paused briefly, not because I didn't have an answer but because I wanted my words to be clear, simple, and firm. "No, nothing happened," I said quietly, "I just didn't make it." There was silence on the other end, heavy and unfamiliar, as if my response had landed in a place he didn't expect. "What do you mean you didn't make it?" he asked, this time the calm slipping away. I could almost hear his mind racing, trying to process something that had never happened before. I took a slow breath, still calm, still steady. "I mean exactly that, Darian, I didn't pay it." The shift was immediate. His tone changed, sharper now, mixed with disbelief. "Mom, that payment is due. You know that. Why would you just not pay it?" And there it was, not concern for me, not curiosity about why, just expectation, as if my role had never changed, as if I was still operating on the same silent agreement. I didn't react emotionally. I had already had that conversation with myself the night before, because I'm not responsible for it anymore. I replied, my voice even, not loud, not defensive, just certain. The silence that followed felt longer this time, heavier, like something inside him was starting to crack. "What are you talking about?" he said, now clearly frustrated. "You've always handled this. Why are you suddenly changing things?" I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of weakness but to stay grounded in the truth I had already accepted. "Exactly, Darian," I said gently, "I've always handled it. And that's the problem." He didn't respond immediately, and for the first time I could sense that he was actually listening, not reacting, not dismissing, just listening. "I've been helping you for years," I continued, "but somewhere along the way, it stopped being help and started becoming expectation, and I allowed that." My words were not filled with anger, they were filled with clarity, and that made them stronger, harder to ignore. "So what? You're just going to stop like this?" he asked, and now there was something new in his voice, not just frustration but uncertainty. I opened my eyes and looked out the window, the sunlight falling quietly across the room. Everything outside remained calm even as this moment shifted everything between us. "Yes," I said simply, "I already have." He exhaled sharply, and I could hear the stress building on his side. "Mom, this isn't small, this is serious. I could lose the house." And for a brief moment, I felt that familiar pull. The instinct to fix things, to step in, to protect. But this time I didn't move toward it. I stood still, grounded in my decision. "I understand that," I replied, "but this is your responsibility, not mine." Those words were not easy to say, but they were necessary, because this was no longer just about money. This was about breaking a pattern that had gone on for far too long. He went quiet again, and this silence felt different. Not confused, not reactive, but reflective, like he was finally being forced to see a reality he had avoided. "Why are you doing this now?" he asked, his voice lower, less aggressive, almost searching, and that was the moment everything became clear. This was not just about the payment, this was about the shift. The power you thought was fixed had moved, and you didn't know how to stand without it. I didn't rush my answer. I let the truth settle before I spoke. Because of what you said last night, I said calmly, you called me a burden. There it was, out in the open, no longer hidden, no longer ignored. The line that changed everything. He didn't interrupt, he didn't argue, he just listened, and I realized something. I continued, if I'm a burden, then I shouldn't be carrying responsibilities that aren't mine. The silence that followed was the loudest one yet, not filled with tension but with understanding slowly forming. I wasn't attacking him, I wasn't trying to hurt him, I was showing him a truth he had never been forced to face, that my presence in his life had value, and that value could not be reduced to convenience. I didn't mean it like that, he said finally, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had, and I knew why, because deep down, he understood that words reveal more than we intend. Maybe you didn't, I said gently, but that's how it came out, and it made me realize I needed to make a change. I wasn't asking for an apology, I wasn't demanding anything, I was simply standing in my truth, and that was something he had never seen from me before. The conversation didn't explode into an argument, it didn't turn dramatic, instead it settled into something quieter, something more real, because this was not a moment of conflict, it was a moment of awakening, for both of us. For him, it was the realization that support is not guaranteed, and for me, it was the understanding that love does not require self-sacrifice without respect. When the call ended, I placed my phone down slowly and sat back. My heart was steady, my mind was clear, and for the first time in a long time, I felt balanced, not pulled in different directions, not weighed down by expectations, just grounded. This was the power shift, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. The roles had changed, the dynamic had shifted, and nothing would ever go back to the way it was before. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, because when someone is forced to stand on their own for the first time, the real story is just getting started. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. They carried a different kind of energy, one filled with awareness, growth, and a shift neither of us could ignore. I didn't call Darian, and he didn't call me immediately either, and for the first time in years, that silence didn't make me anxious, it made me peaceful, because I knew something important was happening, not on the surface, but deep within both of us. He was learning what life felt like without my constant support, and I was learning what life felt like when I finally chose myself. Each day I moved through my routine with a calm confidence. I made my tea in the morning, sat by the window, and allowed myself to enjoy the quiet without feeling responsible for anyone else's problems. It was a new feeling, unfamiliar at first, but slowly it became something I embraced, something I deserved. Then one afternoon, there was a knock at my door, not rushed, not aggressive, just steady. I knew it was him even before I opened it, and when I did, I saw a different version of Darian standing there. His posture was softer, his expression less certain, as if the weight he had been avoiding had finally settled on his shoulders. "Mom," he said quietly, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because this moment wasn't about words, it was about everything that had changed between us. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat down across from each other, no tension, no raised voices, just a calm space where truth could exist. He looked at me, really looked this time, not as someone he depended on, but as someone he was beginning to understand. "I've been trying to figure things out," he said slowly, "and I didn't realize how much you were actually doing." I listened without interrupting, not because I had nothing to say, but because this moment belonged to him, to his realization, to his growth. Everything felt easy before. He continued, "I didn't question it. I didn't think about it. I just assumed things would always be handled." He paused, his voice lowering, and I see now that I was wrong. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no excuses, just honesty, and that made all the difference, because this wasn't forced, it was real. I nodded slightly, allowing his words to settle. "Do you understand why I stopped?" I asked gently, My voice calm but firm. He didn't hesitate this time. Yes, he said, because I disrespected you, and I took you for granted. Those words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that comes from true understanding, not just surface apology. I felt something shift in that moment, not a return to the past, but the beginning of something healthier, something more balanced. I never wanted to hurt you, he added, his voice softer now, and I believed him, because sometimes people don't realize the damage they cause until they are forced to face the consequences. I know, I replied, but intentions don't change. Impact, and what you said made me realize I had to make a change, not just for you, but for myself. He nodded, taking that in, not resisting it, not avoiding it, just accepting it, and that was the growth I had hoped for, not perfection, but awareness. So, what happens now? He asked, and there it was, the question that defined everything moving forward. I didn't rush to answer, because this wasn't a moment to fall back into old patterns. This was a moment to build something new, something stronger. Now, I said slowly, you take responsibility for your life, and I support you in ways that are healthy, not in ways that make you dependent. He listened carefully, understanding that this wasn't rejection, it was balance. I'm still your mother, I continued, but I'm also a woman who deserves respect, peace, and boundaries. He nodded again, this time with a deeper understanding, as if those words had finally found their place within him. The conversation didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest, open, and surprisingly calm, because the truth, when accepted, brings clarity, not conflict. We talked for a while longer, not about the past, but about the future, about responsibility, about growth, about doing things differently, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were meeting each other as equals, not as someone giving and someone taking, but as two people learning, growing, and understanding. When he stood up to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me. Thank you, he said, and I knew he didn't just mean for the past, he meant for the lesson, for the change, for the moment that forced him to grow. I smiled, not out of relief, but out of peace, because this wasn't about fixing everything overnight, it was about creating something better over time. After he left, I sat down again in the quiet of my home, but this time the quiet felt different. It felt full of strength, full of clarity, full of a new beginning. I realized something deeply important in that moment. Love is not about how much you give, it's about how much respect exists between you. And sometimes the most powerful act of love is not holding on, but letting go just enough for growth to happen. I didn't lose my son, I helped him find himself, and in the process, I found myself too, stronger, wiser, and more at peace than ever before. And that is the lesson he never expected, that the woman he once called a burden would become the reason he learned responsibility, respect, and true appreciation. If this story touched your heart, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who needs this message. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that conversation, but it became real. And sometimes real is far more powerful than perfect. The days that followed were no longer built on silent sacrifice but on clear understanding. I woke up each morning with a different kind of energy, not rushed, not burdened, but steady, as if I had finally stepped into a version of my life that had been waiting for me all along. The house felt lighter, not because anything physical had changed, but because that weight I had carried for years was no longer there. I no longer checked my phone with that quiet pressure of responsibility. I no longer calculated what I needed to give next. Instead, I asked myself a question I had ignored for so long. What do I want? And at first, the answer didn't come easily, because when you spend years putting others first, you forget how to choose yourself. But slowly, gently, I began to remember. I started with small things, taking walks in the morning, sitting in peaceful silence without feeling guilty, allowing myself to rest without thinking I needed to earn it. And those small moments became something bigger. They became freedom, real freedom, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. Darian and I stayed in touch, but things were different now, not distant, but balanced. He didn't call expecting solutions anymore. He called to share updates, to ask for advice, to connect, and I noticed the change in his voice. The way he spoke carried more responsibility, more awareness, more respect. He was learning, not because I forced him, but because life was now teaching him directly. He began managing his finances, adjusting his lifestyle, making decisions that once felt unnecessary because someone else was always there to carry the weight. And I watched from a distance, not stepping in, not interfering, just allowing him to grow. And that was not easy. There were moments when I felt the old instinct rise again, the urge to help, to fix, to make things easier for him. But I reminded myself of the lesson I had learned. Helping is not always loving. Sometimes loving means stepping back, trusting that the person you care about is capable of standing on their own. One afternoon, he came to visit again, but this time his presence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded. He sat down and smiled, a genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen in a long time. I made the payment, he said, and there was pride in his voice. Not arrogance, but pride, the kind that comes from doing something on your own. I smiled back, not surprised, but deeply satisfied, because this was the growth I had hoped for, not perfection, but progress. I knew you would, I replied, and I meant it, because sometimes people just need the space to realize their own strength. We talked for a while, but the conversation felt easy, natural, no tension, no unspoken expectations, just a mother and her son reconnecting in a healthier way. And in that moment I realized something powerful. Our relationship had not broken, it had transformed. It had shifted from dependence to respect, from expectation to appreciation, from imbalance to harmony, and that transformation was worth everything. As the weeks passed, I continued building my own life, not around others, but around myself. I explored things I had once set aside, reconnected with parts of me I had almost forgotten, and in doing so, I discovered a version of myself that felt stronger, more complete, more at peace. I was no longer just someone who gave endlessly. I was someone who chose wisely, who loved deeply but with boundaries, who supported without losing herself, and that made all the difference. People around me began to notice the change, not because I announced it, but because it showed in everything I did, in the way I spoke, in the way I carried myself, in the calm confidence that no longer needed validation. And I understood then that true strength is quiet. It doesn't need to prove anything, it simply exists. Looking back, I didn't regret what I had done for my son, not at all. Every sacrifice had come from love, and that love was real. But what I had learned was just as important. Love should not come at the cost of your self-respect. It should not make you feel small. It should not turn you into something you are not. Real love grows with respect, with balance, with understanding, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone you love is to stop carrying what they need to learn to carry themselves. That is not abandonment, that is growth, for both of you. And as I sat by the window one evening watching the sun set, I felt a deep sense of peace settle within me, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was right. I had found my balance, my voice, my strength, and most importantly, I had found myself again. This was the life I chose, not out of anger, not out of pain, but out of wisdom, and that made it powerful. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your worth, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs this message, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this.